So I just wanted to make a quick video going over the results of doing the rod bearings on my E46 M3 with 145,000 miles on it now. And some of the pitfalls you can run into and how to make your life a little bit easier if you're planning on tackling this job, especially in your garage. So we'll start off with the bearing condition of the ones that I pulled. I did find some interesting wear. If you could look closely here, the inner edge of almost every single bearing is down to copper, and engine building experts are telling me that either the bearing is too wide for the crank or the crank itself has a little bit of a bevel on it and the bearing just didn't match the bevel on the crank. And apparently it's not a huge deal, but I went with ACL race bearings for the new bearings. Didn't want to film the whole process because it was quite involved and there's other videos on YouTube about it, but just want to say after 145,000 miles, there's no really bad signs of wear. So mine was a 2003 model year. And that's actually kind of that middle transition period where BMW was recalling the bearings or replacing them with the revised bearings versus just shipping the car with the revised bearings. So being 2003 in that transition period, I didn't really know which bearings were actually in the car. I tried to look it up by the build date and everything. Couldn't really find what information of what bearings were in my car previously. So after all that, my findings, condition wasn't really too bad. So if you do plan on tackling this job, one thing you really have to be careful of is these bolts here. This is a new version of it, but there's 3 of these Allen bolts holding your oil pump on, and I didn't have my Allen key at the exact right angle and they were kind of stuck on there, and I ended up stripping one of those out, and it took me like 2 hours to try and extract one of the old ones. I don't know if I still have it, but yeah, that was a nightmare. One other thing to be aware of is all of the 6mm bolts that hold on the oil pan, they're all different sizes or all different lengths. So you really have to make sure that all your oil pan bolts go exactly back in the right place, or else you'll bottom them out and it won't actually hold the oil pan in place. So I kind of found that out the hard way. Put the oil pan all back on, and some of the bolts were not the right length and the right spot and caused a lot of issues. One other thing, you have 2 options. You can either let the subframe hang down, and that kind of works when you have the car up on a lift because you can kind of like reach your hand underneath there, access the bearings and everything. But when you're working on a garage floor on jack stands, and letting that subframe just hang down, not really the best situation. If I were to do it again in hindsight, I would remove the subframe completely and get that out of the way. It would make the job a lot easier. Also, make sure you switch out your engine mounts because it's a great time to switch those out. I went with some ECS tuning stock OEM style ones. I actually found out that I don't have a crazy amount of miles, 140,000, but I found out that my engine mounts were so compressed and old that the motor was actually hitting my front sway bar and a couple other things in the back. So it was hanging lower, and my fan was almost hitting the fan shroud too because the motor just sunk down and not in its original spot. So yeah, get those changed out. That's a really good thing to keep an eye on. And especially if you have aftermarket sway bars or thicker, heavier sway bar, that your motor's gonna end up, or your oil pan's gonna hit that bar and possibly crack the oil pan. So watch out for that. And then most kits come with this, but there's a little tiny O-ring that goes from the oil pickup tube to the oil pump itself. Make sure you get that replaced while you're in there. Cheap insurance. And then one final thing I'll send you guys off with is there's two types of rod bolts. There's an M11 and M10. The M11s you can reuse, and my earlier car, I think from 2001 to 2003, the end of 2003, they all have the M11 bolts that you can reuse and retorque. The M10s in the later cars, so 2004 to 2006, E46 M3s, you have to replace the rod bolts. So you can either get new OEM ones or you have to switch out to ARP bolts. Me personally, I would go with a set of OEM rod bolts for the M10s. I only say that because I've seen in the forums that people use ARP bolts and they actually have too much clamping force and they'll actually oval out your rods. So where your rod bearings sit, it'll clench them too tight and you'll get a little bit of ovaling and destroy your bottom end. So personally, I would just go new set of M10 rod bolts, kind of call it a day. So I'm really happy that I can get the E46 driving again. And I was kind of just not really driving the car because of the report I had of my oil analysis. Didn't really come back great. There's a lot of copper in the oil, so I'm like, I figured I'd do the rod bearings. So, I mean, they didn't end up being that bad. It was just because that inner edge is worn. So if any of you guys know what that inner edge wear is from, a lot of my friends, they said they've never seen that before in the rod bearings. So if you guys know what the deal with that is, let me know in the comments, any engine builders out there. So should be making some more E46 content, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching.